we are at risk of choking our oceans in plastic, with a knock-on effect on our food chain and human health. We will ban single-use products made of plastic.
Presenting the Green Deal, an ambitious roadmap to a climate-neutral Europe.
It's also for the people. And there's a huge transition ahead of us, and we have to invest in it.
Right now, the Amazon rainforest is being consumed by fire.
China will increase coal production in a move that could threaten the country's climate change goals.
Space tourism has been another giant leap for greenhouse gas pollution. Even the water vapour released by William Shatner's ride with Blue Origin can result in global warming when it's released into the upper atmosphere.
What the am I doing this for? Welcome to Catch the Eye Politics. In this video, we'll discuss the what, how, and why of Europe's climate ambition. And we'll figure out whether it's even going to make a difference. First things first, why is Europe doing all of this? As so often with the EU, our story starts in Berlin.
I declare the document adopted.
And then picks up pace in Paris.
L'accord de Paris pour le climat est accepté.
Here's the short of it. In 2016, after decades of diplomatic deadlock, world leaders signed the Paris Agreement, a landmark international treaty on stopping climate change. In a nutshell, the Paris Agreement says, first, that we have to limit global warming to well below 2 degrees Celsius, or better yet, 1.5 degrees Celsius, and second, that we need to bring down greenhouse gas emissions as soon as possible, reaching net zero in the second half of the century. Greenhouse gases are stuff like CO2 and methane, by the way. You might have heard of them. Importantly, the Paris Agreement notes that developing countries will take longer to cut emissions and that wealthier nations must support them financially. Why? Because it's mostly rich countries that got us into this mess in the first place, with Europe just as much to blame as the United States. All of this means that the EU has both a moral and a legal responsibility to fight climate change. But there's another reason to do it. Europe is actually warming faster than the global average, and there are 4 key threats for the continent that will get much worse if we don't rapidly cut emissions. First, deadly heat waves. Second, decreased agricultural output. Third, water scarcity. Fourth, dangerous flooding. Now, the impacts will differ between Europe's regions. While the south will probably suffer the most, the north might even see some limited economic benefits from climate change. But don't get your hopes up. The overall effects will be negative for Europe, especially if we don't get better at preparing ourselves for what's coming. So on top of its legal and moral responsibility, fighting climate change is also in the EU's own best interest. But if you're watching this video, I probably don't have to convince you that human-made climate change should be a top priority. What you might be wondering instead is whether Europe is truly saving the planet, or if it's all just a drop in a warming ocean bubbling with methane. To find the answer, let's first look at what the EU is doing to stop climate change. Historically, EU climate policy has been split into 2 buckets: stuff covered by the EU ETS and stuff not covered by the EU ETS. What's the ETS? It's the EU's emissions trading system, a cap-and-trade carbon market that limits the amount of greenhouse gases that certain sectors of the economy can emit every year. Here's how it works in just 16 seconds.
Every year, companies get some permits to emit CO2. Some companies use up exactly the number they get. Others may need more than they received, so they have to buy extra permits at auctions or from competitors. Now everyone will want to go green. Plus, the amount of new permits is reduced every year until it eventually reaches zero and the economy is completely carbon-free.
Of course, in practice, this only works if there aren't too many permits to begin with and no loopholes to game the system. But there were. A lot. Luckily, the EU fixed these problems over time, making the ETS its most effective climate policy today. One study found that it saved about 1.2 billion tons of CO2 between 2008 and 2016. That's like planting 20 billion trees. So that's the EU ETS. The other bucket is stuff that doesn't fall under this carbon market and is mostly regulated by national policies, if at all. We call this effort sharing. because all EU member states share the effort in reducing emissions in these sectors according to specific targets agreed by everyone. The good thing about effort sharing is that everyone can come up with very targeted and creative ways to make things greener in their own economy. The bad thing is that different EU countries have different starting points and uneven resources to do this. This has meant that some countries were more successful than others in reducing emissions, which creates all sorts of problems. All that changed in 2020 with the introduction of the European Green Deal. There's lots of confusion around what the European Green Deal is. In short, it's a grand plan for how to make Europe the first climate-neutral continent by 2050 through ambitious policy changes. See, it's not any specific flower, it's the whole garden. Ursula von der Leyen came up with this idea to win support from the European Parliament after she was chosen to become the President of the European Commission by the European Council after the 2019 European elections. Watch this video if you don't have a clue what I just said. Don't worry, you're not alone. Put simply, our Green Deal garden has 5 main flower beds. Let's look at what the EU is doing in each of them. Starting with the biggest one, energy. Here, the goal is to switch everything to renewables, nuclear, and green hydrogen. To do this, we'll also need to build out energy storage and power grids. This is expensive, annoying, complex, and sometimes bad for the environment. But the alternative is so much worse. Second, industry. This is about switching factories to renewable electricity or green hydrogen, designing products so they will last longer, and getting better at reusing and recycling materials. This can get expensive in the short term, but pays off in the long run, so the challenge is encouraging green investments at a time when cash is short. Third, domestic transport and international shipping and aviation. Most importantly, the EU wants to make our vehicles less dirty, first by making engines more efficient and ultimately by replacing them with batteries or hydrogen fuel cells. Also, fuels like gasoline and diesel may be put in the EU ETS and become more expensive. The issue here is that all of this could make mobility less affordable for normal people and cause a public backlash against climate action. Fourth, buildings and homes. This is all about renovating and making our built environment more energy efficient, using cutting-edge technology and sustainable materials like wood. The challenge lies in modernizing Europe's buildings without losing their rich history. Fifth, agriculture, land use, and forestry. This one's great because nature can actually help us balance out some of the emissions from other sectors by taking CO2 out of the atmosphere, not to mention all the other benefits from protecting our environment. But there's also a trade-off. Organic farming is better for nature and animals, but more resource-intensive and not necessarily more climate-friendly. And protecting land often means not producing food there, which we obviously need to survive, especially in tough times like these. But the European Green Deal is not just about planting all these flowers, it also deals with how to water them. In some ways, this is actually the most important part. The consulting company McKinsey estimated that it will cost the EU 28 trillion euros to reach net zero. Most of that money will have to be redirected from dirty towards clean technologies. But as you can imagine, that's easier said than done. The EU is trying to make sure that less money is invested in oil wells, coal mines, sweatshops, and other stuff that is obviously bad for people and the planet. It's hard enough to do that, but it's even harder to agree where the money should go instead. The biggest fight is playing out over nuclear energy, which some countries love more than anything, and others hate from the depths of their hearts. Nuclear is certainly better for the climate than coal, but what about the toxic waste? Finally, there's the question of how to keep weeds out of the garden. And by that I mean greenwashing. What's that? Basically, greenwashing is when companies or institutions claim that they're helping the climate effort, when really, they're just trying to steal a spot in the sun. The EU is always working on finding ways to keep greenwashing out of the garden, but just like with real weeds, it's a never-ending struggle. Now, gazing across our lovely Green Deal garden, you may marvel at the blooming beds and think, look at all these beautiful flowers we've planted. But maybe you should ask yourself, which flowers are we missing? For example, the EU does not have a carbon tax, which many experts say would be the most efficient way to clean up the economy. There's also very little in our garden to promote biking and walking, which are much cleaner ways of getting around than any electric car could ever dream to be. And what about the idea of minimalism? Buying less stuff means having to produce less, which means having to pollute less. In fact, climate scientists are very clear that we will not be able to reach our targets without changing the way we live. That includes driving less, flying less, eating less meat and dairy, living in smaller houses, working from home. And yet, the EU is doing very little to encourage these sorts of behavioral changes. Think about it. Paper straws, which are what got us started down this path in the first place, are probably one of the few annoying green policies that the EU is enacting at all. And they're not even principally about climate change. But why? Because, let's face it, any politician that forces people to give up their big cars or juicy steaks will probably not be re-elected. So nobody wants to touch that stuff. Then again, if you want to keep your garden protected, you have to make sure people don't start stomping around in it. Keeping some of the less popular flowers out is what makes it possible to grow anything at all. Sadly, politics is the art of the possible. Now that we know what the EU is doing, and not doing, we can answer the central question of this video. Will it be enough? Let's listen to both sides. The Climate Action Tracker rates the EU's policies as insufficient to stay within 1.5 degrees Celsius of global warming. But we are constantly improving. And the war in Ukraine, as horrific as it is forcing us to give up Russian fossil fuels ahead of schedule. Yeah, and we're replacing them with fracked LNG. Plus, we're actually moving backwards when it comes to agricultural policies. Well, the climate law requires the EU and its member states to reach their climate targets overall. Germany even has a strict emissions budget enforced by its constitutional court. And if they fail, the real power to change things lies with big corporations and the super rich. The EU only makes up less than 8% of global emissions anyway. But that doesn't include international aviation and shipping, not to mention all the emissions from the stuff that the EU imports from abroad. The Green Deal barely addresses any of that, and EU laws take forever to have an effect. They should have started working on this a long time ago. Okay, but the EU can be a role model for other countries around the world. You can already see the Brussels effect doing its magic in places like the United States, Australia, even China. Plus, the EU helps developing countries go green with international climate finance and joint projects. Good for them, but this comes too late for places like the Solomon Islands, which are literally disappearing in the Pacific Ocean. 1.2 degrees Celsius of warming already priced in now. Maybe more if there are unexpected setbacks or we reach climate tipping points. Fine. The 1.5 degrees target is probably out of reach by now, and climate change will only get worse before it gets better. But every fraction of a degree matters to stop the worst, so every gram of CO2 saved matters too. Look, the European Green Deal will not be enough to stop climate change, but it can be a part of the solution. Is the EU saving the world? No. But if we don't do anything, we will never fix the problem. And here are 5 things you can do to become a part of the solution too. Vote for people who fight for the climate. Don't give your money to polluters. Start eating less beef and less mutton. Share this video with a friend. And as always, keep your eyes open. I hope you liked this video and that you learned something new today. Let us know in the comments below which part of the video caught your eye. And if you want to keep learning, you can find links to all the sources we used, plus some bonus reading material in the video description. Or just watch this video on why the EU is so slow. First, wow, I remembered this text without looking. That's it. Goodbye.